Digimon Tamers was a Japanese anime television show produced by Toei Animation. The show featured a total of 51 episodes that were broadcast in Japan from April 2001 to March of 2002, and then in the USA from September 2001 to June of 2002. In the USA, the show was also known as Digimon Season 3. Unlike its predecessor series, Digimon Adventure and Digimon Adventure 02, Digimon Tamers took place in a brand new setting and involved new characters, and its story had far more intricacies. Much of what makes Digimon Tamers so interesting has often been attributed to the creativity of Japanese screenwriter 𝐃𝐢𝐠𝐲 Konaka. But there's an oddity of Konaka's having worked on a Digimon project. His works are known to have dark tones, often dabbling in the realm of human psychology. A prominent example of which is the 1998 anime series, Serial Experiments Lain, whose story delves rather deeply into the complexities of psychology and philosophy. As far as Digimon Tamers was concerned, Konaka would not shy away from implementing complex themes either, regardless of the demographics at whom the show may have been aimed. Not only did he take the Digimon franchise in a direction greatly contrasting that with the Digimon Adventure series, but he also created a work of art that is genuinely remarkable in its own right. The best way I've found to describe Digimon Tamers is to say that it is a kids' show made for adults. Now, while certainly not as deep in complexity as Serial Experiments Lain, Digimon Tamers remains an exceptional show in large part because of Konaka's willingness to engage in those darker themes, even though children would most certainly be watching the ongoing show. Among other things, Konaka would manage to insert some Lovecraftian imagery in Tamers. Naturally, this was due his penchant for the Cthulhu mythos, although he denies there is any presence of Lovecraft in Tamers. Still, there are many, including myself, who would argue otherwise that Lovecraftian themes are indeed present in the show, intentionally or not. The D-Reaper, for instance, an entity that would become the primary antagonist of the show, would serve as a prominent example of a cosmic horror. However, aside from the horrific imagery and themes, what also makes the story more adult in its complexity is that the show has a basis in reality. Much like Serial Experiments Lain, Digimon Tamers has a story that can serve as a commentary for how the internet has changed the world around us so dramatically. So much so, in fact, that the internet has almost indeed become this other world, in a manner of speaking. Of greater interest, however, is the fact that the story of Digimon Tamers also deals with the role of a secular government in the realm of the internet, and how a tyranny of mass surveillance might manifest itself within it. In Digimon Adventure, the Digimon are creatures from an alien world, a world which one assumes always existed parallel to the real world. The digital world of the Adventure series was a fantasy realm, spontaneously generated from the imaginations of children. However, in Digimon Tamers, the Digimon are artificial constructs that were created by human software engineers. These Digimon live as sentient beings within a digital network. This was how Konaka wanted to ground their conception in reality. He imagined Digimon were made by the same processes as one would have developed Linux, for example. In other words, the Digimon in Tamers exist as primitive artificial intelligences that were developed in, say, Silicon Valley, and other similar locations around the world. Furthermore, Konaka's conceptions had Digimon existing in a state using open source code and GNU-style constructs. What this means is that the Digimon are not owned by a commercial entity like Bandai. Rather, much like how the real-world internet works, Digimon are technically free-range and allowed to roam the entire worldwide network, evolving and changing in their own ways. They were made autonomous, in other words. Konaka's conceptions would further differentiate themselves from the Adventure series and how the Digimon behaved as a species. He believed that the Adventure Digimon were too strongly humanized, or anthropomorphized, and that such a depiction was not in keeping with the spirit of the franchise in general. And so through Tamers he would explore the bestial side of the digital monsters. In his words, he wanted to rethink what it is to be a Digimon. And so the Digimon in Tamers were portrayed as more primitive creatures, beheld to killer instincts for the sake of achieving evolution. In Konaka's words, this concept would be keeping in with the original concept of the Digital Monsters game, which existed before the Digimon Adventure series. In a roundabout way, Konaka had taken a deconstructionist approach to the franchise through Digimon Tamers, and one could even apply his deconstructionist methods of Digimon to Nintendo's Pokémon, given the similarities of both franchises. However, as far as I'm aware, the Pokemon franchise has never taken itself as seriously as the Digimon franchise has done through Tamers. Beyond the spectacle of watching fantastic creatures fight one another, 𝐾𝐫𝐬𝐿 told a story about the meaning behind all the fighting and the evolving. He explored the philosophical parameters of the genre. Interestingly, Tamers' story does not feature a clear-cut boundary between the forces of light and darkness as we saw play out in Digimon Adventure. This is another great example made for Tamers having been directed at a mature audience, for the ability to tell good from evil does indeed become far more complicated as one grows up. And indeed, much of Tamers does deal with the difficulty of determining who one's friends and enemies truly are. Ultimately, there are no true villains featured in the show. There are no Dark Masters, nor are there any corrupt children committing heinous acts for the sole purpose of being evil. Rather, the root of all conflict throughout Tamers comes as a result of well-intentioned groups or individuals acting through vice rather than virtue. And yes, even an entity as vile as the D-Reaper may elude villainous classification, given it was conceived as an antiviral security program that was merely acting in accordance with how it was originally designed. As explained earlier, the Digimon in Tamers were not created with a moral compass, and so would be constantly in conflict with other Digimon. This would differ greatly from Adventure, where the Digimon do have semblances of good and evil, and the series' plot centers about that conflict. But the digital world in Tamers is a savage place where Digimon live to kill, consume, and evolve. Yet all that changes when the Digimon encounter a small group of human children. The story's main protagonists are 3 children who encounter a variety of digital monsters in the real world. This is a reverse of what Digimon Adventure had done. Rather than the children becoming digitized and going to a parallel world, their Digimon partners manifest themselves in the real world, becoming flesh and blood, and they establish a bond with and become partners to those children. And within these intimate encounters with humanity, the Digimon would learn more about friendship, love, and kindness and compassion. Aspects that would work to undermine their bestial natures and cause them to become more human as a result. In this manner, the role of antagonists throughout the story of Digimon Tamers could be characterized by the ongoing internal struggles the characters experience. In other words, all the characters are in strife with their own nature. Another reason 𝐾𝐽𝐫𝐬𝐿 reversed how Digimon Adventure did things was to instill the idea of giving life to one's passions and aspirations. In thematic representation, this would be the flesh and blood realization of the Digimon partners. Interestingly, this would be a mirror for Digimon Adventure, as what is heavily implied is that the Digimon in Tamers were essentially given life and made real through the will of imagination. Digimon are made manifest because the children, and humanity by extension, desired them to be real. As a side note, that also adds huge significance to the show's theme song, Biggest Dreamer. Concerning Digimon evolution, 𝐾𝐽𝐫𝐿 sought a far more thematic approach to that act as well. He believed that subsequent partner evolutions should have been more than a means of overcoming any given threat on the table. Rather, 𝐾𝐽𝐫𝐿 wanted evolution to be a symbol of the ongoing emotional maturation the main characters would be experiencing throughout the show. And alongside evolution, 𝐾𝐽𝐫𝐿 would conceive of the card slash mechanic, which would allow the children to actively modify their Digimon partners in battle. This would mean that rather than be passive observers as the children were in Digimon Adventure, the children in Tamers had an active role in aiding their Digimon partners. On top of this, 𝐾𝐽𝐫𝐿 also conceived of the idea of having the children eventually merge with their Digimon partners when evolving into their ultimate forms. And that would be the culmination of the bond that they developed, the thematic journey into maturation achieving its apex with the two becoming one. The world of Digimon Tamers takes place in 2001, the same year it was released as a television show. Much of the story takes place in Tokyo, in West Shinjuku. This is why the Tokyo Metropolitan Government Building is featured so prominently throughout the show. It's a reminder that this isn't just some fantasy city conjured from some make-believe comic book. This is Tokyo. 𝐾𝐽𝐫𝐿 was also purposeful in having this show take place at the turn of the century and the new millennium. Through Tamers, he wanted to allow children to imagine a bright future for this century and the coming century. And looking back at the show, I would say 𝐾𝐽𝐫𝐿 definitely succeeded in telling that story. But I would also add that a bittersweetness coats it all, especially the ending. In fact, the more sorrowful and darker aspects of the show may have just as equally served as a detractor to those otherwise expecting something wholly uplifting and happy. But once again, this is why I would say the show is a kids' show made for adults, as the journey to maturity often entails varying degrees of loss in light of any gains. Maturation is a painful process, and Konaka spared very little grit in pushing his story through that process. All the more why Digimon Tamers is such a fantastic piece of art. Anyway, the year is 2001, and Digimon exist as artificial constructs created by humans. Long before their eventual realization into the material world, Digimon were seen as mere figments, just a bunch of ones and zeros. Much like the franchise by Bandai, the Digimon and Tamers are featured in cards, video games, and toys. Not at all regarded as living creatures or even people, but all that will change. Looking at his early planning notes, something made clear is that Konaka had originally intended to implement the children from the Digimon Adventure series into Tamers somehow. That's something that would have occurred later on in the show. Somehow the children in Tamers would have been peripherally aware of the children in the Adventure universe. However, those plans would not come to fruition within the final product. Rather, as a blatant hailback to the franchise in general, the character Ryo Akiyama makes a cameo appearance in the show, thereby connecting the Tamers world with the Adventure world. In retrospect, however, Ryo's presence was forced and entirely unnecessary. He doesn't really add anything to the story. To be frank, there are many, including myself, who dislike Ryo Akiyama's presence, if only because references to a parallel universe makes the world of Digimon Tamers feel far less organic and self-contained. In other words, less real. And Tamers, after all, is supposed to feel far more down-to-earth than adventure. And that realism is largely exemplified by the children in Digimon Tamers. Takato, Genria, Ruki, and the other children aren't some kind of special chosen ones destined to fight the powers of darkness. Instead, they're modern children, like you or me. People who one day just happen to have Digimon partners thrown onto their laps. And these children do indeed go on a fantastic adventure with their Digimon partners. But that adventure occurs based on their unlikely happenstance, not predestined determination. And unlike Digimon Adventure, whose journey to the digital world happens as early as episode 1, entering the digital world in Tamers is an event that actually occurs halfway into that show. And so the preliminary half of Tamers, which occurs in the real world, serves as a grand establishment for all the events that will inevitably lead the children on a journey into the digital world. While the children in the Adventure series enter the digital world as a unified group from the very beginning, Konaka started Tamers in such a manner as would have the main cast be unacquainted at first, and then be introduced to one another. And there the unlikely heroes also become unlikely companions under the ongoing supernatural circumstances. This means that Tamers' first arc serves as a kind of prequel that the Adventure series never had, where we know how the characters met, and how they eventually become a team. My research for the information in this video was largely conducted by perusing www.konaka.com, 𝐃𝐢𝐠𝐲 Konaka's personal website. The bulk of this essay is also based on reading his early planning resource, where he goes over many of the concepts he developed for the show. In the future, I plan on covering more of the show in general, in addition to focusing on the individual characters. If you enjoy this kind of content, please give the video a like and subscribe. I have an active Patreon you can donate to as well, but you can also make donations to my Cash App. The links for both can be found in the video description. Thank you all for watching, and stay tuned for more.